Have you ever wondered what happened to the world's first murderer after he was banished from the presence of God? Most people know the story of Cain and Abel, but what came next has been hidden in the shadows of biblical history for thousands of years. The lineage of Cain didn't just disappear into obscurity. Instead, it became the foundation of human civilization itself, giving birth to the world's first cities, the first musicians, the first metal workers, and technologies that would shape humanity forever. But here's what will shock you. The very people who rebelled against God became the inventors of everything we depend on today. From the music that moves our souls to the tools that build our world, it all traces back to a cursed bloodline that was supposed to wander the earth in shame. How is that possible? How could such profound innovation emerge from such spiritual darkness? If you're ready to uncover one of the Bible's most overlooked mysteries, comment 777 below and let me know you're prepared for this journey. Because what we're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about human progress, divine judgment, and the complex relationship between rebellion and creativity. Today we're diving deep into the forgotten line of Cain's sons, and I promise you, by the end of this revelation, you'll never read Genesis the same way again. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this is just the beginning of a series that will transform your understanding of biblical history. Let's start with a question that haunts the pages of Scripture. After Cain murdered his brother Abel in a field, God confronted him with these chilling words, "Where is your brother Abel?" Cain's response was defiant, cold, almost mocking. "Am I my brother's keeper?" But what followed was a curse that would echo through generations. God declared that the ground would no longer yield its strength to Cain, that he would become a restless wanderer on the earth. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Cain, fearing for his life, cried out that his punishment was too great to bear, that whoever found him would kill him. Wait. Stop right there. Who exactly was Cain afraid of? If Adam, Eve, and Abel were the only other humans alive and Abel was now dead, who were these mysterious others that Cain feared would him? This question opens the door to mysteries take vengeance upon that most biblical scholars prefer to avoid. But we're not afraid to ask the hard questions here. God, in his mercy, placed a mark upon Cain, a divine protection that would warn others not to harm him. Then Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Nod in Hebrew means wandering or vagrancy. It was a place of restlessness, of spiritual exile, of separation from the divine presence that had once walked with humanity in the cool of the evening. But Cain didn't just wander aimlessly. The Bible tells us something remarkable happened next. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. And here's where it gets fascinating. Cain built a city and named it after his son Enoch. Think about this for a moment. The world's first recorded city was built not by the righteous line of Seth, but by the cursed murderer Cain. This wasn't just a settlement or a camp. This was humanity's first attempt at urbanization, at creating something permanent in defiance of the curse of wandering. The name Enoch is loaded with meaning. It means to discipline, to train up, to initiate. Cain was determined that his son would carry on his legacy, that through Enoch something lasting would be established. There's a bitter irony here. While God had cursed Cain to be a wanderer, Cain responded by building the most permanent structure imaginable, a city. Was this an act of faith or an act of rebellion? Was Cain trying to overcome his curse through human ingenuity, or was he making peace with his destiny in his own way? What's even more intriguing is that this city represents the beginning of human civilization as we know it. Before Enoch, humanity lived in scattered family groups, perhaps small tribes, but nothing approaching organized urban life. Cain City became the prototype for every city that would follow. From ancient Babylon to modern New York, from Jerusalem to Rome, every urban center traces its conceptual roots back to that first city built by a man under God's curse. But the story doesn't end with Enoch the city builder. The genealogy continues, and each generation brings us deeper into the mystery of how rebellion and creativity can coexist in the human heart. Enoch became the father of Irad, whose name means city of witness. Irad fathered Mehujael, whose name carries the ominous meaning destroyed by God or struck by God. Then came Methushael, which means man who is of God, a name that suggests perhaps a longing for divine connection even within this rebellious lineage. Each of these names tells a story. They reveal that even in the line of Cain there was an awareness of God, a recognition of divine judgment, and perhaps even a desire for reconciliation. These weren't people who had forgotten about God. They were people living in the tension of knowing God existed while being separated from His presence by their ancestors' sin. And then we come to Lamech, the seventh generation from Adam through Cain's line. Lamech represents both the pinnacle and the nadir of this genealogy. He was a man of violence who boasted of his brutality, yet he became the father of the most innovative and creative individuals in early human history. This paradox strikes at the heart of one of the Bible's most profound mysteries. How can such darkness produce such light? Lamech married two women, Ida and Zillah, making him the first recorded polygamist in human history. This wasn't just a personal choice. It was a departure from God's original design for marriage as established in Eden between one man and one woman. Lamech was rewriting the rules of human relationships, establishing patterns that would echo through history with both positive and devastating consequences. But it was Lamech's children who would change everything. From his wife Adah came two sons, Jabal and Jubal. From Zillah came Tubal-Cain and a daughter named Naamah. These four individuals would become the founding fathers and mother of human civilization, each establishing fundamental pillars of culture and technology that continue to shape our world today. Jabal became the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. This might sound simple, but think about what this means. Jabal didn't just domesticate animals, he revolutionized human survival. He created the nomadic pastoral lifestyle that would sustain countless peoples throughout history. He developed systems of animal husbandry that allowed humans to thrive in environments that would otherwise be uninhabitable. From the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to the Bedouins of the Arabian Peninsula, Jabal's innovation made their way of life possible. But here's what's remarkable. Jabal's development of pastoral nomadism might have been the first systematic use of animals for food, representing a departure from the original vegetarian diet that God had prescribed in Eden. Was this innovation born of necessity in a post-Eden world? Or was it another step away from God's original design? The text doesn't tell us directly, but it raises questions about how human survival needs intersect with divine intentions. His brother Jubal became the father of all those who play stringed instruments and pipes. Imagine that. The first musician in human history came from the line of Cain. Music, that universal language that speaks to the human soul, that lifts our hearts in worship and moves us to tears, originated in a lineage marked by rebellion and violence. Jubal created the first harp, the kinnor, which would later become associated with King David's worship. The same type of instrument that would praise God in the temple had its origins in the cursed line of Cain. This creates a theological puzzle that has fascinated scholars for centuries. How do we reconcile the beauty of music with its origin in a rebellious bloodline? Perhaps the answer lies in understanding that God's gifts are irrevocable, that creativity itself is part of the divine image that remains in humanity even after the fall. Even in rebellion, humans retain the capacity to create beauty, to innovate, to produce things that ultimately serve God's purposes even when that wasn't the original intent. Tubal-Cain represents perhaps the most significant technological leap in early human history. He became the forger of all instruments of bronze and iron, the world's first metalworker. This wasn't just about making tools. Tubal-Cain ushered in the age of metal, fundamentally transforming human capability. Bronze and iron tools made agriculture more efficient, construction more sophisticated, and unfortunately warfare more deadly. The significance of Tubal-Cain working with both bronze and iron simultaneously challenges conventional archaeological timelines that separate these into distinct historical periods. According to evolutionary models, the Bronze Age and Iron Age were separated by centuries. But here in Genesis, we see both technologies emerging together from the same innovative mind. This suggests a level of technological sophistication in the antediluvian world that secular archaeology hasn't fully acknowledged. But Tubal-Cain's legacy is double-edged. While he created tools that advanced civilization, he also forged the first weapons of war. His innovations fueled the violence that would eventually provoke God's judgment in the flood. The same creativity that could build and heal could also destroy and kill. This duality in human innovation, this capacity for technology to serve both constructive and destructive purposes, originated right here in the line of Cain. And then there's Nama, Tubal-Cain's sister, the only daughter mentioned in Cain's genealogy. Her name means pleasant or lovely, but her significance remains largely mysterious in the biblical text. Some traditions suggest she played a crucial role in preserving and transmitting the cultural achievements of the antediluvian world. But her story remains tantalizingly incomplete. What we're seeing here is the establishment of the fundamental pillars of human civilization: urban planning, agriculture, music, metallurgy, and cultural transmission. All of these emerged from a lineage that began with murder, continued through exile, and flourished in separation from God's direct presence. This challenges our assumptions about how God works in human history and raises profound questions about the relationship between divine blessing and human achievement. The line of Cain reveals something uncomfortable yet undeniable about human nature. Our greatest innovations often emerge from our deepest struggles. Our most beautiful creations can arise from our darkest impulses, and our capacity for both good and evil is inextricably intertwined. These forgotten sons of Cain weren't just historical footnotes. They were the architects of human civilization itself. But this is just the beginning of their story. What happened to this remarkable lineage? How did their innovations survive the flood? And what can we learn from their example about the complex relationship between human creativity and divine purpose? The implications of what we've just discovered run deeper than most people realize. These weren't just ancient inventors tinkering with primitive tools. These were the founding fathers of human civilization, and their influence extended far beyond their immediate historical moment. The technologies they pioneered, the cultural patterns they established, the very foundations of organized society all trace back to this cursed bloodline that was supposed to fade into obscurity. Think about this for a moment. Every time you listen to music, you're experiencing an art form that originated with Jubal, son of the murderer's lineage. Every time you use a metal tool, drive a car, or live in a city, you're benefiting from innovations that began with Cain's descendants. The irony is staggering. The very people who were cut off from God's presence became the architects of everything that makes modern life possible. But here's where the story takes an even more fascinating turn. The Bible doesn't present these achievements as purely negative. There's no condemnation of music, no denunciation of metallurgy, no criticism of urban planning. Instead, these innovations are presented as facts, as developments that would shape human history for millennia to come. This suggests something profound about how God views human creativity, even when it emerges from rebellion. The genealogy of Cain forces us to grapple with uncomfortable truths about the nature of divine judgment and human potential. God cursed Cain to be a wanderer, yet Cain's descendants became the most settled, the most innovative, the most culturally significant people of their generation. Was God's curse ineffective, or was there something deeper happening here? Something that reveals the complexity of divine justice and mercy. Consider the parallel genealogies presented in Genesis. While Cain's line is producing cities, music, and metallurgy, Seth's line is walking with God. Seth's descendant Enoch walked so closely with God that he was translated to heaven without seeing death. Yet it's Cain's line that's driving human progress, creating the technologies and cultural patterns that would define civilization itself. This creates a tension that runs throughout human history. The relationship between spiritual devotion and worldly achievement. Some scholars suggest that this represents two different aspects of human calling. Perhaps Seth's line preserved the spiritual heritage of humanity, maintaining the connection to God that would eventually produce Noah, Abraham, and ultimately Christ. Meanwhile, Cain's line developed the cultural and technological heritage that would make complex civilization possible. Both lines were necessary. Both served divine purposes, even though only one maintained direct fellowship with God. But we can't ignore the darker implications of Cain's legacy. Lamech, the father of these great innovators, was also a man of violence who boasted about his brutality. He declared to his wives that if Cain would be avenged sevenfold, then Lamech would be avenged 77-fold. This wasn't just poetic exaggeration. It was a fundamental escalation of the violence that began with Cain's murder of Abel. Lamech represents the culmination of a pattern that began with his ancestor. Cain killed in a moment of passion driven by jealousy and anger. But he tried to hide his crime, showing at least some sense of shame or fear. Lamech, by contrast, killed in calculated retaliation and then bragged about it to his wives. The progression from hidden shame to open boasting reveals how sin compounds across generations, how each compromise makes the next one easier. This escalation of violence in Cain's line provides crucial context for understanding the flood narrative that follows. The earth became filled with violence, and every imagination of the thoughts of man's heart was only evil continually. This wasn't just moral decay. It was the logical culmination of patterns established in the earliest generations of human history. The same creative energy that produced music and metallurgy also produced increasingly sophisticated methods of destruction. The weapons that Tubal-Cain forged weren't just tools. They were force multipliers that made violence more efficient and deadly. Archaeological evidence from the ancient world shows that the development of metallurgy coincided with increasingly sophisticated warfare. Bronze and iron weapons changed the scale and intensity of human conflict, making possible the kind of systematic violence that would eventually provoke divine judgment. Yet even in this context, we see hints of divine restraint and mercy. God didn't immediately destroy Cain after the murder of Abel. Instead, he marked him for protection and allowed his lineage to flourish. The innovations that emerged from this line would serve beneficial purposes throughout human history. The same metallurgical techniques used to forge weapons would also create agricultural tools that fed multitudes. The urban planning principles established by Cain would eventually house the temple in Jerusalem. The musical traditions begun by Jubal would ultimately praise God in the tabernacle and temple. This pattern reveals something profound about how God works in human history. He doesn't simply destroy what is corrupted, he redeems it. He takes what was intended for evil and transforms it for good. The innovations of Cain's line, born in rebellion and nurtured in violence, would ultimately serve the purposes of God's kingdom. This doesn't excuse the rebellion or minimize the consequences of sin, but it demonstrates the overwhelming power of divine grace to work through even the most unlikely circumstances. The preservation of these innovations through the flood presents another fascinating dimension to this story. When Noah built the ark, he didn't just preserve animal species, he preserved human knowledge and technology. The post-flood world didn't start from scratch technologically. The descendants of Noah carried with them the accumulated wisdom of the antediluvian world, including the innovations pioneered by Cain's line. This continuity explains how civilization could rebuild so quickly after the flood. The knowledge of metallurgy, music, agriculture, and urban planning didn't die with the flood. It was preserved through Noah's family and their descendants. The Tower of Babel, built just generations after the flood, demonstrates sophisticated engineering and organizational capabilities that could only have been possible if technological knowledge had survived the deluge. But this preservation also meant that the dual nature of human innovation survived as well. The same technologies that could build and heal could still destroy and kill. The same organizational principles that could create beautiful cities could also build monuments to human pride and rebellion. The Tower of Babel represents the continuation of patterns established in Cain's line, using human innovation to achieve independence from God rather than dependence upon Him. The story of Cain's descendants challenges us to think more deeply about the relationship between spiritual condition and cultural contribution. We often assume that people who are separated from God cannot produce anything of lasting value. But the evidence from Scripture suggests otherwise. Some of humanity's most significant innovations have emerged from contexts of spiritual rebellion or indifference. This doesn't mean that spiritual condition is irrelevant to human achievement. Rather, it suggests that God's common grace extends to all humanity, enabling even the rebellious to contribute to the common good. The ability to innovate, create, and build is part of the image of God that remains in humanity despite the fall. This image is corrupted but not erased, weakened but not destroyed. The implications for how we view human culture and achievement are profound. We cannot simply divide the world into sacred and secular categories, assuming that only explicitly religious activities have spiritual significance. The music that moves our souls, the technologies that improve our lives, the organizational system that enable complex societies all participate in the ongoing work of God in human history, even when their creators don't acknowledge or intend this participation. Yet we also cannot ignore the darker implications of this story. The same creative capacities that produce beauty and utility can also produce destruction and oppression. Every technological advance brings with it the potential for both blessing and curse. The metallurgy that creates plowshares can also forge swords. The organizational principles that build cities can also create systems of exploitation. The artistic expressions that inspire worship can also promote idolatry. This dual potential in human innovation reflects the fundamental ambiguity of the human condition itself. We are created in God's image, capable of remarkable creativity and achievement. Yet we are also fallen, prone to use our gifts in ways that serve our own interests rather than God's purposes or the common good. The line of Cain embodies this tension in its most extreme form, producing both the foundations of civilization and the patterns of violence that would ultimately provoke divine judgment. As we continue to unpack this remarkable genealogy, we're forced to confront questions that remain relevant today. How do we evaluate human achievement in light of its spiritual context? Can we appreciate the innovations of Cain's line while also recognizing their problematic origins? What does it mean for our own creative endeavors that some of humanity's most significant breakthroughs emerged from contexts of rebellion and violence? These questions become even more complex when we consider the ultimate destiny of Cain's line. and how their legacy intersected with God's redemptive plan for humanity. The genealogy of Cain presents us with one of Scripture's most perplexing paradoxes, and we're about to dive even deeper into its mysteries. Because what happened next in this bloodline reveals truths that most Christians have never considered. Truths that challenge our fundamental assumptions about divine blessing, human achievement, and the complex ways God works through even the most unlikely circumstances. As we examine the legacy of Lamech's children more closely, we discover that their innovations weren't just technological breakthroughs. They were paradigm shifts that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of human civilization. Each of these individuals established patterns that would echo through millennia, creating the very foundation upon which all subsequent human progress would be built. But here's what will astound you. Their achievements came with a price that humanity is still paying today. Let's start with Jabal, the father of nomadic pastoralism. On the surface, his contribution seems straightforward enough. He figured out how to domesticate animals and live in tents, creating a mobile lifestyle that could adapt to different environments and seasons. But the implications of his innovation run far deeper than most people realize. Jabal wasn't just creating a new way to make a living. He was establishing the first alternative economic system in human history. Think about this carefully. Before Jabal, human survival was tied directly to the land, to the specific place where you planted and harvested. Your prosperity was limited by the fertility of your particular plot of ground. But Jabal's pastoral innovation broke that connection. Suddenly, wealth could be mobile. Flocks and herds could multiply, could be moved to better grazing, could be traded across vast distances. This was the birth of liquid wealth, of capital that could grow and move independently of geography. The economic implications were revolutionary. Pastoral nomadism created the first wealth that could compound over time. A flock of sheep could double every few years under the right conditions. Herds could be divided, traded, combined, used as dowries, employed as currency. For the first time in human history, a person's wealth wasn't limited by the size of their garden plot or the fertility of their specific piece of land. This innovation would later enable the patriarchal wealth of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, whose vast flocks and herds made them powerful figures in the ancient world. But Jabal's innovation also introduced something else into human society: inequality on a scale never before possible. When everyone was dependent on small-scale agriculture, the differences in prosperity were relatively modest. One family might have a slightly better harvest than another, but the variations were limited. Pastoral wealth, however, could accumulate across generations. Some families could become vastly wealthier than others, creating the first-class divisions in human society. This wasn't necessarily evil in itself, but it established patterns that would have profound consequences. Wealth concentration would lead to power concentration. Those with the largest flocks would have the greatest influence, the ability to make alliances, to hire protection, to dominate trade routes. The seeds of every subsequent empire, every concentration of political and economic power can be traced back to the innovations that began in Cain's line. Even more intriguingly, Jabal's pastoral lifestyle created the first truly international culture. Nomadic peoples by necessity had to interact with settled populations, trading their animal products for manufactured goods and agricultural surplus. They became the bridges between isolated communities, the carriers of information, technology, and cultural practices across vast distances. Long before there were roads or ships capable of oceanic travel, the descendants of Jabal were creating networks of exchange that connected distant peoples. This international dimension of pastoral nomadism would prove crucial for the spread of both blessing and corruption throughout the ancient world. The same networks that could carry beneficial innovations could also transmit violence, false religious practices, and moral corruption. The mobility that enabled prosperity also enabled the rapid spread of whatever values and practices the nomadic peoples embraced. Now let's turn our attention to Jubal and examine the profound implications of his musical innovations. Music, as we've noted, is one of humanity's most universal languages, capable of transcending cultural and linguistic barriers in ways that mere words cannot. But Jubal's creation of instrumental music introduced something entirely new into human experience: the ability to manipulate emotions systematically and powerfully. Before Jubal, human emotional expression was limited to voice, rhythm, and physical movement. These were immediate, personal, and relatively limited in their range and impact. But instrumental music opened up entirely new possibilities for emotional manipulation and spiritual influence. The harp and flute that Jubal created could produce sounds that the human voice could never achieve, could sustain notes and create harmonies that would move the soul in ways previously impossible. This wasn't just artistic innovation. It was the birth of a technology that could influence human consciousness directly and powerfully. Music has the unique ability to bypass rational thought and speak directly to the emotions, to create states of mind that can lead to worship, to warfare, to romance, to despair. Jubal had unknowingly created one of humanity's most powerful tools for spiritual and psychological influence. The double-edged nature of this innovation becomes clear when we consider how music would be used throughout subsequent history. The same musical principles that would later praise God in the temple were also used to accompany pagan rituals, to whip armies into battle frenzy, to seduce and manipulate. Music could elevate the human spirit toward divine worship or drag it down into the basest passions. Archaeological evidence from the ancient world reveals that music was central to every religious system, every cultural tradition, every attempt to connect the human and divine realms. The instruments that Jubal pioneered became the foundation for increasingly sophisticated musical traditions that would shape the spiritual life of every civilization that followed. But here's what's truly remarkable. The Bible presents Jubal's innovation without condemnation, even though it emerged from the cursed line of Cain. This suggests that God himself recognizes music as a legitimate and valuable form of human expression, regardless of its origins. The capacity to create beauty, to move the human heart through organized sound, is apparently so fundamental to human nature that even rebellion cannot corrupt it entirely. This principle would later be confirmed in the Psalms, where David, the man after God's own heart, would use the very type of instruments pioneered by Jubal to worship the Lord. The kinnor, The stringed instrument that Jubal created became the harp of David, the soundtrack of Israel's worship, the accompaniment to some of the most beautiful poetry ever written. What began in rebellion was ultimately redeemed for worship. The implications for how we understand human creativity are profound. If music, one of our most powerful forms of artistic expression, could emerge from the line of Cain and yet be used for divine worship, then perhaps all human creativity participates in some way in the divine image, regardless of its immediate context or the spiritual condition of its creators. This doesn't mean that all music is equally valuable or appropriate. The same power that can elevate can also corrupt. But it does suggest that the capacity for artistic creation itself is a gift that transcends the moral condition of the artist. God can use even the innovations of the rebellious to serve his purposes and bring glory to his name. Tubal-Cain's metallurgical innovations present perhaps the most complex example of this principle. His mastery of bronze and iron working was undoubtedly the most significant technological advancement of the antediluvian world, fundamentally transforming humanity's relationship with the physical environment. But it also accelerated the very violence that would ultimately provoke divine judgment. The ability to work metals represented a quantum leap in human capability. Bronze tools were harder and more durable than stone, capable of precision and efficiency that had never before been possible. Iron tools were even more revolutionary, strong enough to clear forests, dig irrigation channels, and construct buildings of unprecedented size and complexity. These weren't just better versions of existing tools. They enabled entirely new categories of human activity. Agricultural productivity exploded with metal plowshares and harvesting tools. Construction techniques advanced dramatically with metal hammers, chisels, and measuring devices. Transportation improved with metal wheels, axles, and ship fittings. The entire pace of human development accelerated as metal tools made possible projects that would have been unthinkable in the Stone Age. But this same metallurgical knowledge also revolutionized warfare. Bronze spear points and arrowheads were far more deadly than their stone predecessors. Iron swords could slice through bronze armor like paper. The same techniques used to create agricultural tools could forge weapons of unprecedented lethality. Tubal-Cain had given humanity the power to kill more efficiently than ever before. The escalation of violence that followed is documented not just in scripture but in archaeological evidence from across the ancient world. The development of metallurgy coincided with increasingly sophisticated fortifications, larger armies, and more systematic warfare. The very tools that enabled civilization also enabled its destruction on a scale never before possible. Yet even this dark legacy contains hints of divine purpose. The metallurgical knowledge that Tubal-Cain pioneered would later be essential for constructing the tabernacle and temple. The bronze altar, the golden lampstand, the silver trumpets, all of these sacred objects required the very techniques that Tubal-Cain had developed. The same skills used to forge weapons of war would ultimately serve to create instruments of worship. The complexity of this legacy challenges our tendency to categorize innovations as simply good or evil. Metallurgy itself is morally neutral. Its value depends entirely on how it's used. The same knowledge that can create tools for healing can create weapons for killing. The same techniques that build temples can construct instruments of oppression. This moral ambiguity in technological innovation reflects a fundamental truth about human creativity. Our capacity to create always comes with the responsibility to choose how our creations will be used. Tubal-Cain's descendants would face this choice repeatedly throughout history, and their decisions would shape the trajectory of human civilization. The preservation of metallurgical knowledge through the flood ensures that this moral challenge would continue in the post-Diluvian world. Noah's descendants inherited not just the benefits of metal technology, but also its dangers. Every generation would have to decide whether to use these powerful tools for construction or destruction, for blessing or cursing. And what about Nama, the mysterious daughter whose story remains largely untold? Her inclusion in this genealogy is puzzling precisely because she's the only woman mentioned in Cain's line, the only daughter deemed worthy of recording by name. Why would the biblical author break the pattern of listing only sons to include this one woman? Some ancient traditions suggest that Nama played a crucial role in preserving and transmitting the cultural achievements of the antediluvian world. If this is true, then she represents something profound about the role of women in cultural preservation and transmission. While her brothers were innovating and creating new technologies, perhaps Nama was ensuring that these innovations would survive and spread. The name Nama means pleasant or lovely, suggesting that she may have been associated with beauty, aesthetics, or cultural refinement. In a world increasingly dominated by violence and technological competition, perhaps she represented the preservation of gentler arts, the maintenance of beauty and grace in the midst of an increasingly brutal civilization. Her mystery invites us to consider what other contributions to human civilization might have been made by women whose stories weren't recorded, whose innovations weren't credited, whose influence was exercised behind the scenes. The biblical genealogies focus primarily on male lineages, but this doesn't mean that women weren't playing crucial roles in cultural development and preservation. As we step back and consider the full impact of Lamech's children, we see that they established the four fundamental pillars of human civilization: economic systems through Jabal's pastoralism, artistic expression through Jubal's music, technological advancement through Tubal-Cain's metallurgy, and cultural preservation through Nama's mysterious but significant role. These four elements would interact and reinforce each other throughout subsequent history. Economic prosperity would enable artistic patronage. Technological advancement would facilitate both economic and military expansion. Cultural preservation would ensure that innovations could be transmitted across generations and geographical boundaries. The combination of these four elements would make possible every subsequent achievement in human civilization. But the same combination that enabled achievement also enabled corruption. Economic inequality could fund oppression. Artistic expression could promote idolatry. Technological advancement could increase the scale of destruction. Cultural preservation could transmit both wisdom and wickedness across generations. The legacy of Lamech's children thus presents us with the fundamental ambiguity of human civilization itself. Our greatest achievements and our most terrible failures emerge from the same creative capacities, employ the same tools, and follow the same patterns. The line between blessing and curse, between construction and destruction, between worship and idolatry, runs not between different technologies or cultures, but through the heart of every human being. This realization forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about our own relationship to the innovations and achievements of human civilization. Are we using the tools and technologies available to us to serve God's purposes or our own? Are our economic activities contributing to justice and flourishing or to inequality and oppression? Are our artistic expressions elevating the human spirit toward divine truth or dragging it down toward base desires? The story of Cain's line suggests that these questions cannot be answered simply by looking at the external forms of our activities. The same activities that serve divine purposes in one context can serve corrupt purposes in another. What matters is not just what we do, but why we do it. Not just the tools we use, but the heart with which we use them. As we prepare to explore what happened to this remarkable lineage and how their innovations survived the judgment of the flood, we must grapple with the possibility that we ourselves are inheritors of both the blessings and the curses that began in the line of Cain. The same creative capacities that enabled their achievements enable ours. The same moral choices that they faced, we face still. The question that haunts every page of this genealogy becomes the question that must haunt our own lives. Will we use the gifts and opportunities we've inherited to serve the purposes of God's kingdom? Or will we, like so many of Cain's descendants, use them to build kingdoms of our own that ultimately crumble under the weight of their own pride and violence? The answer to that question would ultimately be written in fire and water, in judgment and salvation, in the greatest cataclysm the world had ever known. But before we reach that climactic moment, we need to understand something that most people miss entirely about Cain's lineage. These weren't just random innovators scattered across history. They were building something together, something that would challenge the very foundations of divine authority itself. You see, the achievements of Lamech's children weren't happening in isolation. They were creating an integrated system, a complete civilization that could function independently of God's direct provision. Jabal's mobile wealth, Jubal's emotional manipulation through music, Tubal Cain's technological mastery, and Nama's cultural preservation were combining to form something unprecedented in human history. A society that believed it could thrive without divine dependence. Think about what this means. For the first time since Eden, humanity was developing the tools and systems necessary to create security, prosperity, and meaning without reference to their creator. They had mobile wealth that could provide for any need. They had music that could create spiritual experiences without divine encounter. They had technology that could overcome natural limitations. They had cultural systems that could preserve knowledge and wisdom across generations. This wasn't just rebellion. It was systematic replacement. They were constructing an alternative to the relationship with God that humanity had lost in the garden. And here's what's terrifying. It was working. The cities were thriving. The innovations were spreading. and the descendants of Cain were becoming the dominant force in human civilization. But success without God's blessing carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. As these innovations spread and developed, they began to amplify the very qualities that had made Cain's line notorious in the first place: pride, violence, and rebellion against divine authority. The tools that could build could also destroy. The wealth that could bless could also corrupt. The music that could inspire could also deceive. Genesis provides us with a haunting glimpse of where this trajectory was leading. By the time we reach the 6th chapter, the earth is filled with violence. Every imagination of the thoughts of man's heart is only evil continually. And God himself regrets that he made humanity. This wasn't random moral decay. It was the logical conclusion of the path that began with Cain's murder of Abel and reached its full expression in the civilization built by his descendants. The violence that Lamech boasted about had become systematic. The weapons that Tubal-Cain forged had made conflict more deadly and efficient. The economic systems that Jabal pioneered had created inequalities that bred resentment and exploitation. The cultural achievements that seemed so impressive had become monuments to human pride rather than expressions of divine creativity. Archaeological evidence from across the ancient world supports this biblical narrative. The earliest cities show signs of increasing militarization, more sophisticated fortifications, and evidence of systematic warfare. Metal weapons become more common and more deadly. Social stratification becomes more pronounced, with clear divisions between rulers and subjects, between rich and poor, between the powerful and the powerless. But perhaps most significantly, religious practices during this period show a marked shift away from simple worship toward complex systems designed to manipulate divine favor. The same innovative spirit that created useful technologies was being applied to spiritual matters, producing elaborate rituals, impressive temples, and sophisticated theological systems that promise to control rather than submit to divine power. This is where the story takes a turn that reveals something profound about the nature of divine justice. God's response to this systematic rebellion wasn't immediate destruction. Instead, he provided one final opportunity for repentance, one last chance for humanity to turn away from the path of violence and pride that Cain's line had pioneered. That opportunity came in the form of Enoch, not Cain's descendant, but Seth's. While Cain's lineage was building cities and forging weapons, Seth's descendant was walking with God so closely that he was translated to heaven without seeing death. The contrast couldn't be more stark. One lineage was achieving everything the world considers success while moving further from God with each generation. The other was achieving nothing the world values while moving closer to God with each step. Enoch's translation serves as both a warning and a promise. It was a warning that God had not abandoned his interest in human affairs, that he was still present and active even when his people seemed to be a powerless minority. It was a promise that those who chose to walk with God rather than build their own kingdoms would not be forgotten or abandoned, even when the whole world seemed to be moving in the opposite direction. But the most remarkable figure in this narrative is Noah, who represents the convergence of both divine calling and human innovation. Unlike Enoch, who was removed from the world before judgment fell, Noah was called to work within the world, using the very technologies that Cain's line had developed to serve God's purposes of salvation rather than human purposes of self-glorification. Consider what Noah's Ark represents in the context of Cain's legacy. The construction of that massive vessel required sophisticated knowledge of metallurgy for tools and fastenings, advanced understanding of engineering for structural integrity, and complex organizational skills for managing such an enormous project. In other words, Noah had to employ all the innovations that Cain's descendants had pioneered, but he used them in service of divine command rather than human ambition. The ark becomes a powerful symbol of how God can redeem even the achievements of the rebellious for his own purposes. The same technologies that had enabled violence and pride could also enable salvation and preservation. The same organizational principles that had built cities of rebellion could build a vessel of redemption. The same metallurgical knowledge that had forged weapons of war could create tools of construction and preservation. But Noah's use of these technologies was fundamentally different from their original application. He wasn't building for his own glory or security. He was building in obedience to divine command. He wasn't trying to make a name for himself. He was preserving the name of God through the preservation of creation itself. He wasn't seeking to control his environment. He was submitting to God's plan for environmental judgment and renewal. This distinction reveals something crucial about the moral nature of technological innovation. The tools themselves are morally neutral. Their value depends entirely on the purposes for which they're employed and the spirit in which they're used. Metallurgy in the hands of Cain produced weapons of violence. Metallurgy in the hands of Noah produced instruments of salvation. The flood narrative thus represents more than divine judgment on human wickedness. It represents divine redemption of human achievement. The innovations of Cain's line weren't destroyed. They were preserved through Noah's family and repurposed for godly ends. The knowledge that had served rebellion would now serve restoration, but this preservation came with a sobering recognition. The same moral choices that had faced the antediluvian world would face every subsequent generation. The capacity for both good and evil that had characterized Cain's descendants was not eliminated by the flood. It was carried forward in the hearts of Noah's children. The post-flood world would have to grapple with the same fundamental question that had destroyed the previous civilization. Would humanity use its God-given creativity to serve divine purposes or to pursue independent kingdoms? Would the innovations that made civilization possible be employed for blessing or for curse, for construction or for destruction, for worship or for idolatry? The answer began to emerge almost immediately after the flood waters receded. Noah's descendants quickly demonstrated that they had inherited both the technological knowledge and the moral weaknesses of their predecessors. The Tower of Babel represents the first major test of post-flood humanity, and tragically it reveals that the lessons of the flood had not been learned. The builders of Babel employed the same organizational principles, the same technological innovations, and the same fundamental motivation that had characterized Cain's civilization. the desire to make a name for themselves, to create security through human achievement, to build something so impressive that they would never again be scattered or forgotten. The tower wasn't just a building project. It was a declaration of independence from divine authority. Like Cain's city before it, Babel represented humanity's attempt to create meaning and security through their own efforts, rather than through relationship with God. The same creative capacities that God had intended for His glory were once again being employed for human self-glorification. God's response to Babel reveals both His justice and His mercy. The confusion of languages prevented the completion of this particular project, but it didn't destroy the technological knowledge or organizational capabilities that made such projects possible. Instead, it scattered these capabilities across the earth, ensuring that no single human empire could again threaten to replace divine authority completely. This scattering had profound implications for how the innovations of Cain's line would influence subsequent human history. Rather than being concentrated in one location where they could be used for massive projects of human pride, these technologies were dispersed among many peoples, many cultures, many different contexts where they could serve a variety of purposes. The result was the emergence of diverse civilizations, each employing the basic innovations pioneered by Cain's descendants but adapting them to different environments, different challenges, different cultural values. Some of these civilizations would use their inherited technologies primarily for conquest and oppression. Others would use them for trade and cultural exchange. Still others would use them for artistic expression and intellectual advancement. But in every case, the fundamental moral challenge remained the same. Would these inherited capabilities be used to serve God's purposes or human ambitions? Would they contribute to justice and flourishing or to exploitation and destruction? Would they elevate the human spirit toward divine truth or drag it down toward base desires? The diversity of responses to this challenge throughout human history reveals both the persistence of the pattern established in Cain's line and the ongoing possibility of redemption. Every generation faces the same choice that faced Cain's descendants: whether to use their creative gifts in service of divine purposes or in pursuit of independent kingdoms. The legacy of the forgotten line of Cain thus extends far beyond the antediluvian world. Their innovations became the foundation for every subsequent human civilization. Their moral choices became the template for every subsequent generation's struggle with pride and rebellion, and their ultimate fate became a warning about the consequences of systematic rejection of divine authority. Understanding this legacy helps us make sense of the complex relationship between human achievement and spiritual condition that characterizes our own time. Like the descendants of Cain, we live in an era of remarkable technological innovation, artistic creativity, and organizational sophistication. Like them, we face the temptation to view these achievements as evidence of our independence from divine authority rather than as gifts to be employed in divine service. The question that haunted the antediluvian world haunts our world as well. Are we using our inherited capabilities to build kingdoms for ourselves or to serve the kingdom of God? Are we employing our technologies, our wealth, our artistic gifts, Our organizational abilities in ways that honor the Creator or in ways that replace Him? The line of Cain offers no easy answers to these questions, but it does provide sobering warnings about the consequences of choosing human pride over divine humility, technological sophistication over spiritual wisdom, impressive achievements over faithful obedience. Their story reminds us that the most impressive human accomplishments mean nothing if they're built on foundations of rebellion against God. It warns us that the same gifts that can serve divine purposes can also serve destructive ends if they're employed with wrong motives. It challenges us to examine not just what we're building, but why we're building it, not just what we're achieving, but whose glory our achievements serve. Most importantly, the legacy of Cain's line points us toward the ultimate resolution of the tension between human creativity and divine authority. That resolution wouldn't come through the elimination of human innovation, but through its redemption, not through the destruction of human achievement, but through its transformation in service of divine love. The same God who preserved the innovations of Cain's rebellious line through Noah's Ark would ultimately redeem all human creativity through the incarnation, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. In Christ, every human gift finds its proper purpose. Every technological capability finds its rightful use. Every artistic expression finds its ultimate meaning. The forgotten line of Cain thus points us not just backward to the origins of human civilization, but forward to its ultimate destiny in the kingdom of God, where every tongue will confess and every knee will bow, where the innovations that began in rebellion will finally serve their intended purpose of bringing glory to the Creator of all. But before that glorious consummation, we must grapple with the immediate implications of what we've discovered about Cain's descendants and their enduring influence on human civilization. As we delve deeper into the implications of this remarkable genealogy, we encounter questions that shake the very foundations of how we understand divine providence and human responsibility. The line of Cain presents us with a theological puzzle that has challenged believers for millennia. How do we reconcile God's curse upon a murderer with the extraordinary blessings that flowed from his lineage? Consider this carefully. God himself declared that Cain would be a restless wanderer, cursed from the ground, separated from divine presence. Yet within just a few generations, this cursed bloodline had produced the architects of human civilization itself. Were these innovations a violation of God's curse, or were they somehow part of a larger divine plan that we're only beginning to understand? The answer may lie in recognizing a profound truth about how God works in human history. Divine judgment and divine mercy aren't opposing forces that cancel each other out. Instead, they work together in ways that reveal the complexity and wisdom of God's character. The curse upon Cain was real and devastating, but it didn't eliminate the image of God that remained within him and his descendants. This preserved divine image manifested itself in creativity, innovation, and the drive to build and create. Even in rebellion, even under curse, the descendants of Cain retained the capacity to reflect God's creative nature. Their achievements weren't evidence that God's judgment had failed. They were evidence that God's image in humanity is more resilient than we often imagine. But here's where the story becomes even more profound. The innovations of Cain's line weren't just random acts of human creativity. They were addressing fundamental human needs that had emerged as a result of the fall. Before Eden's expulsion, humanity had lived in perfect harmony with their environment, with direct access to God's provision and protection. After the fall, they faced challenges that required new solutions, new technologies, new ways of organizing society. Jabal's pastoral innovations addressed the need for mobile food sources in a world where the ground no longer yielded easily. Jubal's musical instruments provided ways to express the spiritual longings that remained even after separation from God's immediate presence. Tubal-Cain's metallurgy offered tools to work more effectively with a cursed ground that resisted human labor. Each innovation was responding to problems created by humanity's separation from God. In this light, the achievements of Cain's descendants can be seen as a form of common grace, God's provision for human needs, even in the context of judgment. These weren't rewards for righteousness, but neither were they evidence of divine abandonment. They were expressions of God's continued care for His creation, even when that creation had chosen to rebel against Him. This understanding transforms how we view the relationship between spiritual condition and cultural contribution. We often assume that only those who are right with God can produce anything of lasting value, but the evidence from Cain's line suggests otherwise. God can use even the rebellious to serve His purposes, even when they don't acknowledge or intend such service. The metallurgical knowledge that Tubal-Cain developed would later be essential for constructing the tabernacle and temple. The musical principles that Jubal pioneered would eventually accompany the worship of Israel. The organizational concepts that emerged from Cain's city building would facilitate the spread of the gospel throughout the Roman Empire. What began in rebellion was ultimately redeemed for divine service. This pattern reveals something crucial about God's sovereignty over human history. He doesn't simply react to human choices. He works through them to accomplish purposes that transcend the immediate intentions of the actors involved. The descendants of Cain thought they were building for their own glory and security. In reality, they were laying foundations that would ultimately serve God's kingdom. But this divine sovereignty doesn't eliminate human responsibility. The fact that God can work through rebellious choices doesn't justify those choices or minimize their consequences. The violence that escalated through Cain's line was real and devastating. The pride that characterized their achievements was spiritually destructive. The separation from God that marked their existence was a genuine tragedy, both for them and for the world they influenced. The flood that eventually destroyed this civilization wasn't an overreaction to minor moral failures. It was a necessary response to systematic rebellion that had corrupted the very foundations of human society. The same innovations that had blessed humanity with cities, music, and metallurgy had also enabled unprecedented levels of violence and oppression. This dual legacy of blessing and curse reflects a fundamental truth about human nature that we ignore at our peril. We are capable of remarkable achievements and devastating failures, often simultaneously. The same creative capacities that produce beauty can produce destruction. The same technologies that serve justice can enable oppression. The same organizational abilities that build can us to confront this complexity rather than retreat also tear down. The genealogy of Cain forces into simplistic categories of good and evil. Human civilization itself is a mixed legacy, neither purely blessed nor entirely cursed, but a complex interaction of divine image and human rebellion, common grace and moral failure, creative potential and destructive tendency. Understanding this complexity is crucial for how we engage with the world around us. We cannot simply reject all human achievement as corrupted by sin, nor can we uncritically embrace it as evidence of human goodness. Instead, we must learn to discern how God is working through human creativity while also recognizing the ways that human pride corrupts even our best intentions. The story of Cain's descendants provides a template for this kind of discernment. Their innovations were genuine contributions to human flourishing, worthy of appreciation and study. But their motivations were often self-serving, their methods sometimes violent, and their ultimate goals frequently at odds with divine purposes. Learning to separate the wheat from the chaff in human achievement requires this kind of nuanced thinking. This discernment becomes even more important when we consider how the legacy of Cain's line has influenced our own technological age. The principles they pioneered have been developed and refined over millennia, creating capabilities that would have been unimaginable to the original innovators. We live in cities that dwarf anything Cain could have envisioned. We listen to music that employs instruments far more sophisticated than Jubal's harp and flute. We work with metals and materials that make Tubal Cain's bronze and iron seem primitive, but the fundamental moral challenges remain unchanged. Are we using these inherited capabilities to serve God's purposes or our own? Are our cities centers of justice and flourishing or monuments to human pride? Is our music elevating the human spirit toward divine truth or manipulating emotions for base purposes? Are our technologies serving human dignity or undermining it? The answers to these questions cannot be determined simply by examining the technologies themselves. The same smartphone that enables global communication and access to information can also facilitate exploitation and deception. The same urban planning principles that create efficient cities can also produce environments that isolate and dehumanize. The same musical capabilities that inspire worship can promote idolatry and moral corruption. What matters is not just what we create, but why we create it. Not just what we build, but whose glory our buildings serve. Not just what we achieve, but how our achievements affect our relationship with God and our service to others. The line of Cain succeeded brilliantly by worldly standards while failing catastrophically by divine standards. Their achievements impressed their contemporaries but ultimately provoked divine judgment. This sob about success assumption we might have erring reality challenges every and failure, about progress and decline, about the relationship between human achievement and divine approval. The most impressive civilizations can be the most corrupt. The most innovative technologies can serve the most destructive purposes. The most sophisticated cultures can be the most spiritually bankrupt. Yet the story doesn't end in despair. because the same God who judged the corruption of Cain's civilization also preserved its innovations through Noah's Ark. The flood destroyed the corrupt use of these technologies without destroying the technologies themselves. Knowledge was preserved, capabilities were maintained, and the opportunity for righteous application was renewed. This preservation reveals God's commitment to working through human creativity rather than replacing it. He could have started over completely, creating new forms of civilization from scratch. Instead, he chose to redeem and redirect the innovations that already existed, demonstrating his power to transform curse into blessing, rebellion into service, human pride into divine glory. The post-flood world inherited both the capabilities and the moral challenges that had characterized the antediluvian period. Noah's descendants had access to the same metallurgical knowledge, the same organizational principles, the same artistic capabilities that had enabled both the achievements and the corruption of their predecessors. The question was whether they would learn from the mistakes of the past or repeat them in new forms. The Tower of Babel suggests that the lesson was not immediately learned. The same drive for human glory, the same desire for technological solutions to spiritual problems, the same preference for impressive achievements over humble obedience quickly reasserted itself. The builders of Babel employed the inherited technologies not in service of divine purposes but in pursuit of human fame and security. Yet God's response to Babel was measured and redemptive rather than destructive. Instead of destroying the technological capabilities that enabled such projects, he scattered them across the earth, ensuring that no single human empire could again threaten to replace divine authority completely. This scattering created the diversity of cultures and civilizations that has characterized human history ever since. Each of these scattered peoples carried with them portions of the technological and cultural inheritance that had originated in Cain's line. Some developed these inherited capabilities in directions that served justice and human flourishing. Others used them for conquest and oppression. Still others found ways to balance human achievement with divine submission, creating civilizations that honored God while also advancing human knowledge and capability. The diversity of outcomes reveals both the persistent influence of Cain's legacy and the ongoing possibility of redemption. In every generation, in every culture, the same fundamental choice presents itself. Will we use our inherited capabilities to serve God's purposes or our own? Will we employ our technologies, our wealth, our artistic gifts in ways that honor the Creator or in ways that replace Him? The Bible provides numerous examples of individuals and peoples who made this choice well, using their inherited capabilities in service of divine purposes. David employed musical instruments similar to those pioneered by Jubal to worship God and lead Israel in praise. Solomon used metallurgical knowledge descended from Tubal-Cain to construct the temple and its furnishings. Nehemiah employed organizational principles that could be traced back to Cain's city building to rebuild Jerusalem's walls. In each case, the technologies and capabilities themselves were morally neutral. What made the difference was the heart of the user, the purpose for which the capabilities were employed, the spirit in which the work was undertaken. The same tools that could serve rebellion could serve righteousness when wielded by those whose hearts were aligned with God's purposes. This principle extends beyond biblical examples to encompass the entire history of human civilization. Every generation has faced the choice of how to employ its inherited capabilities. Some have used them primarily for self-glorification and the accumulation of power. Others have found ways to serve both human needs and divine purposes simultaneously. The greatest achievements in human history have often emerged when this balance was maintained, when human creativity was channeled in service of divine love rather than human pride. The universities of medieval Europe combined intellectual rigor with spiritual devotion. The great cathedrals merged artistic beauty with worship. The hospitals and orphanages established by Christian missions employed the best available technologies in service of human dignity and divine compassion. The forgotten line of Cain reveals one of Scripture's most profound truths, that God's sovereignty extends even to the rebellious, transforming their innovations into instruments of His eternal plan. From Jabal's pastoral systems to Jubal's musical innovations, from Tubal-Cain's metallurgy to Nama's cultural preservation, these descendants of history's first murderer became the unwitting architects of civilization itself. Their legacy forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality, that our greatest achievements often emerge from our deepest struggles, that divine grace works through human rebellion, and that every innovation we inherit carries both the potential for blessing and the risk of curse. Today, as we benefit from cities, music, technology, and cultural systems that trace their origins to this ancient bloodline, we face the same fundamental choice that confronted every generation since Cain. Will we use our inherited gifts to build kingdoms for ourselves, or will we surrender them in service to the one true King? The answer we choose will echo through eternity just as theirs echoed through time. If this revelation has stirred your heart, don't let it end here. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that God can work through anyone, anywhere, at any time. Subscribe and turn on notifications because this journey through Scripture's hidden mysteries is just beginning. And remember, whether you're a descendant of Cain or Seth, whether your lineage traces through rebellion or righteousness, the same God who redeemed the innovations of the cursed line stands ready to transform your life for His glory. The question isn't where you came from, it's where you're going with what He's given you.